The high hedge hid him from the house now, and so, under the impulse of a deadly fright, he let out all his forces and sped toward a wood in the distance. He never looked back until he had almost gained the shelter of the forest. Then he turned and descried two figures in the distance. That was sufficient. He did not wait to scan them critically, but hurried on, and never abated his pace till he was far within the twilight depths of the wood. Then he stopped, being persuaded that he was now tolerably safe. He listened intently, but the stillness was profound and solemn, awful, even and depressing to the spirits. At wide intervals his straining ear did detect sounds, but they were so remote and hollow and mysterious that they seemed not to be real sounds, but only the moaning and complaining ghosts of departed ones. So the sounds were yet more dreary than the silence which they interrupted. It was his purpose, in the beginning, to stay where he was the rest of the day, but a chill soon invaded his perspiring body, and he was at last obliged to resume movement in order to get warm. He struck straight through the forest, hoping to pierce to a road presently, but he was disappointed in this. He traveled on, but the farther he went, the denser the wood became apparently. The gloom began to thicken by and by, and the king realized that the night was coming on. It made him shudder to think of spending it in such an uncanny place, so he tried to hurry faster, but he only made the less speed, for he could not now see well enough to choose his steps judiciously. Consequently he kept tripping over roots and tangling himself in vines and briars. And how glad he was when at last he caught the glimmer of a light. He approached it warily, stopping often to look about him and listen. It came from an unglazed window opening in a shabby little hut. He heard a voice now and felt a disposition to run and hide, but he changed his mind at once, for this voice was praying, evidently. He glided to the one window of the hut, raised himself on tiptoe, and stole a glance within. The room was small. Its floor was the natural earth, beaten hard by use. In a corner was a bed of rushes and a ragged blanket or two near. It was a pail, a cup, a basin, and 2 or 3 pots and pans. There was a short bench and a 3-legged stool. On the hearth the remains of a faggot fire were smoldering, before a shrine, which was lighted by a single candle, knelt an aged man, and on an old wooden box at his side lay an open book and a human skull. The man was of large, bony frame. His hair and whiskers were very long and snowy white. He was clothed in a robe of sheepskins which reached from his neck to his heels. "A holy hermit," said the king to himself. "Now am I indeed fortunate." The hermit rose from his knees. The king knocked. A deep voice responded, "Enter, but leave sin behind, for the ground whereon thou shalt stand is holy." The king entered and paused. The hermit turned a pair of gleaming, unrestful eyes upon him and said, "Who art thou?" "I am the king," came the answer with placid simplicity. "Welcome, king," cried the hermit with enthusiasm. Then, bustling about with feverish activity and constantly saying, "Welcome, welcome," he arranged his bench, seated the king on it, by the hearth, threw some faggots on the fire, and finally fell to pacing the floor with a nervous stride. "Welcome. Many have sought sanctuary here, but they were not worthy, and were turned away. But a king who casts his crown away, and despises the vain splendors of his office, and clothes his body in rags to devote his life to holiness and the mortification of the flesh, he is worthy, he is welcome. Here shall he abide all his days till death. Come." The king hastened to interrupt and explain, but the hermit paid no attention to him, did not even hear him, apparently, but went right on with his talk with a raised voice and a growing energy. And thou shalt be at peace here. None shall find out thy refuge to disquiet thee, with supplications to return to that empty and foolish life which God hath moved thee to abandon. Thou shalt pray here, thou shalt study the book, thou shalt meditate upon the follies and delusions of this world, and upon the sublimities of the world to come. Thou shalt feed upon crusts and herbs, and scourge thy body with whips daily to the purifying of thy soul. Thou shalt wear a hair shirt next thy skin. Thou shalt drink water only, and thou shalt be at peace, yes, wholly at peace, for whoso comes to seek thee shall go his way again baffled. He shall not find thee. He shall not molest thee. The old man, still pacing back and forth, ceased to speak aloud and began to mutter. The king seized this opportunity to state his case, and he did it with an eloquence inspired by uneasiness and apprehension. But the hermit went on muttering and gave no heed. And still muttering, he approached the king and said impressively, I will tell you a secret. He bent down to impart it, but checked himself and assumed a listening attitude. After a moment or two he went on tiptoe to the window opening, put his head out and peered around in the gloaming, then came tiptoeing back again, put his face close down to the king's, and whispered, I am an archangel. The king started violently and said to himself, Would God I were with the outlaws again, for lo, now am I the prisoner of a madman. His apprehensions were heightened, and they showed plainly in his face. In a low, excited voice the hermit continued, I see you feel my atmosphere. There's awe in your face. None may be in this atmosphere and not be thus affected, for it is the very atmosphere of heaven. I go thither and return in the twinkling of an eye. I was made an archangel on this very spot. It is 5 years ago, by angels sent from heaven to confer that awful dignity. Their presence filled this place with an intolerable brightness. And they knelt to me, king. Yes, they knelt to me, for I was greater than they. I have walked in the courts of heaven, and held speech with the patriarchs. Touch my hand, be not afraid, touch it. There now thou hast touched a hand which has been clasped by Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. For I have walked in the golden courts. I have seen the deity face to face. He paused to give this speech effect. Then his face suddenly changed, and he started to his feet, again saying with angry energy, Yes, I am an archangel, a mere archangel. That might have been Pope. It is verily true. I was told it from heaven in a dream, 20 years ago. Ah, yes, I was to be Pope. And I should have been Pope, for heaven had said it, but the king dissolved my religious house, and I, poor obscure unfriended monk, was cast homeless upon the world, robbed of my mighty destiny. Here he began to mumble again, and beat his forehead in futile rage with his fist, now and then articulating a venomous curse, and now and then a pathetic, Wherefore I am not but an archangel, I that should have been Pope. So he went on for an hour, whilst the poor little king sat and suffered. Then all at once the old man's frenzy departed, and he became all gentleness. His voice softened, he came down out of his clouds and fell to prattling along so simply and so humanly that he soon won the king's heart completely. The old devotee moved the boy nearer to the fire and made him comfortable, doctored his small bruises and abrasions with a deft and tender hand, and then set about preparing and cooking a supper, chatting pleasantly all the time, and occasionally stroking the lad's cheek or patting his head in such a gently caressing way that in a little while all the fear and repulsion inspired by the archangel were changed to reverence and affection for the man. This happy state of things continued while the two ate the supper. Then, after a prayer before the shrine, the hermit put the boy to bed in a small, adjoining room, tucking him in as snugly and lovingly as a mother might, and so with a parting caress left him and sat down by the fire, and began to poke the brands about in an absent and aimless way. Presently he paused, then tapped his forehead several times with his fingers, as if trying to recall some thought which had escaped from his mind. Apparently he was unsuccessful. Now he started quickly up, and entered his guest's room, and said, "Thou art king." "Yes," was the response drowsily uttered. "What king?" "Of England." "Of England? Then Henry is gone." "Alack, it is so. I am his son." A black frown settled down upon the hermit's face, and he clenched his bony hands with a vindictive energy. He stood a few moments, breathing fast and swallowing repeatedly, then said in a husky voice, "Dost know it was he that turned us out into the world houseless and homeless?" There was no response. The old man bent down and scanned the boy's reposeful face and listened to his placid breathing. "He sleeps soundly." And the frown vanished away and gave place to an expression of evil satisfaction. A smile flitted across the dreaming boy's features. The hermit muttered, "So his heart is happy," and he turned away. He went stealthily about the place, seeking here and there for something, now and then halting to listen, now and then jerking his head around, and casting a quick glance toward the bed, and always muttering, always mumbling to himself. At last he found what he seemed to want, a rusty old butcher knife and a whetstone. Then he crept to his place by the fire, sat himself down, and began to whet the knife softly on the stone, still muttering, mumbling, ejaculating. The winds sighed around the lonely place, the mysterious voices of the night floated by out of the distances. The shining eyes of venturesome mice and rats peered out at the old man from cracks in coverts, but he went on with his work, rapt, absorbed, and noted none of these things. At long intervals he drew his thumb along the edge of his knife, and nodded his head with satisfaction. "It grows sharper," he said. "Yes, it grows sharper." He took no note of the flight of time, but worked tranquilly on, entertaining himself with his thoughts, which broke out occasionally in articulate speech. "His father wrought us evil, he destroyed us and is gone down into the eternal fires." Yes, down into the eternal fires. He escaped us, but it was God's will. Yes, it was God's will, we must not repine. But he hath not escaped the fires. No, he hath not escaped the fires, the consuming, unpitying, remorseless fires, and they are everlasting. And so he wrought and still wrought, mumbling, chuckling a low, rasping chuckle at times, and at times breaking again into words. It was his father that did it all. I am but an archangel, but for him I should be pope. The king stirred. The hermit sprang noiselessly to the bedside and went down upon his knees, bending over the prostrate form with his knife uplifted. The boy stirred again. His eyes came open for an instant, but there was no speculation in them, they saw nothing. The next moment his tranquil breathing showed that his sleep was sound once more. The hermit watched and listened for a time, keeping his position and scarcely breathing. Then he slowly lowered his arms and presently crept away, saying, "It is long past midnight. It is not best that he should cry out lest by accident someone be passing." He glided about his hovel, gathering a rag here, a thong there, and another one yonder. Then he returned, and by careful and gentle handling he managed to tie the king's ankles together without waking him. Next he essayed to tie the wrists. He made several attempts to cross them, but the boy always drew one hand or the other away, just as the cord was ready to be applied, but at last, when the archangel was almost ready to despair, the boy crossed his hands himself. And the next moment they were bound. Now a bandage was passed under the sleeper's chin and brought up over his head and tied fast, and so softly, so gradually, and so deftly were the knots drawn together and compacted, that the boy slept peacefully through it all without stirring. The old man glided away, stooping, stealthy, cat-like, and brought the low bench. He seated himself upon it, half his body in the dim and flickering light, and the other half in shadow, and so, with his craving eyes bent upon the slumbering boy, he kept his patient vigil there, heedless of the drift of time, and softly whetted his knife and mumbled and chuckled, and in aspect and attitude he resembled nothing so much as a grisly, monstrous spider, gloating over some hapless insect that lay bound and helpless in his web. After a long while the old man, who was still gazing, yet not seeing, his mind having settled into a dreamy abstraction, observed, on a sudden, that the boy's eyes were open, wide open, and staring up in frozen horror at the knife. The smile of a gratified devil crept over the old man's face, and he said, without changing his attitude or his occupation, "Son of Henry VIII, hast thou prayed?" The boy struggled helplessly in his bonds, and at the same time forced a smothered sound through his closed jaws, which the hermit chose to interpret as an affirmative answer to his question. "Then pray again. Pray the prayer for the dying." A shudder shook the boy's frame, and his face blenched. Then he struggled again to free himself, turning and twisting himself this way and that, tugging frantically, fiercely, desperately but uselessly to burst his fetters. And all the while the old ogre smiled down upon him, and nodded his head, and placidly whetted his knife, mumbling from time to time, "The moments are precious, they are few and precious. Pray the prayer for the dying." The boy uttered a despairing groan, and ceased from his struggles, panting. The tears came then and trickled one after the other down his face, but this piteous sight wrought no softening effect upon the savage old man. Dawn was coming now. The hermit observed it and spoke up sharply, with a touch of nervous apprehension in his voice. "I may not indulge this ecstasy longer. The night is already gone. It seems but a moment, only a moment. Would it had endured a year. Seed of the church's spoiler, close thy perishing eyes, and thou fearest to look upon." The rest was lost in inarticulate mutterings. The old man sank upon his knees, his knife in his hand, and bent himself over the moaning boy. Hark! There was a sound of voices near the cabin. The knife dropped from the hermit's hand. He cast a sheepskin over the boy and started up, trembling. The sounds increased, and presently the voices became rough and angry, then came blows and cries for help, then a clatter of swift footsteps retreating. Immediately came a succession of thundering knocks upon the cabin door, followed by "Hello! Open!" and "Dispatch, in the name of all the devils." Oh, this was the blessedest sound that had ever made music in the king's ears, for it was Miles Hendon's voice. The hermit, grinding his teeth in impotent rage, moved swiftly out of the bedchamber, closing the door behind him, and straightway the king heard a talk, to this effect, proceeding from the chapel. "Homage and greeting, reverend sir. Where is the boy, my boy?" "What boy, friend? What boy?" "Lie me no lies, sir priest, play me no deceptions. I am not in the humor for it. Near to this place I caught the scoundrels who I judged did steal him from me, and I made them confess. They said he was at large again, and they had tracked him to your door. They showed me his very footprints. Now palter no more, For look you, holy sir, and thou, produce him not. Where is the boy? O good sir, peradventure you mean the ragged regal vagrant that tarried here the night. If such as you take an interest in such as he, know then that I have sent him of an errand. He will be back anon. How soon? How soon? Come, waste not the time. Cannot I overtake him? How soon will he be back? Thou needst not stir, he will return quickly. So be it then. I will try to wait. But stop. You sent him of an errand? You? Verily this is a lie. He would not go. He would pull thy old beard, and thou didst offer him such an insolence. Thou hast lied. Friend, thou hast surely lied. He would not go for thee, nor for any man. For any man, no, haply not. But I am not a man. What? Now, O God's name, what art thou then? It is a secret, mark thou reveal it not. I am an archangel. There was a tremendous ejaculation from Miles Hendon, not altogether unprofane, followed by, "This doth well and truly account for his complaisance. Right well I knew he would budge nor hand nor foot in the menial service of any mortal, but Lord, even a king must obey when an archangel gives the word o' command. Let me sh. What noise was that? All this while the little king had been yonder, alternately quaking with terror and trembling with hope, and all the while, too, he had thrown all the strength he could into his anguished moanings, constantly expecting them to reach Hendon's ear, but always realizing with bitterness that they failed, or at least made no impression. So this last remark of his servant came as comes a reviving breath from fresh fields to the dying, and he exerted himself once more, and with all his energy, just as the hermit was saying, "Noise! I heard only the wind. Mayhap it was. Yes, doubtless that was it. I have been hearing it faintly. All the there it is again. It is not the wind. What an odd sound. Come, we will hunt it out." Now the king's joy was nearly insupportable. His tired lungs did their utmost, and hopefully, too, but the sealed jaws and the muffling sheepskins sadly crippled the effort. Then the poor fellow's heart sank to hear the hermit say, "Ah, it came from without, I think, from the copse yonder. Come, I will lead the way." The king heard the two pass out talking, heard their footsteps die quickly away. Then he was alone with a boding, brooding, awful silence. It seemed an age till he heard the steps and voices approaching again, and this time he heard an added sound, the trampling of hoofs, apparently. Then he heard Hendon say, "I will not wait longer. I cannot wait longer. He has lost his way in this thick wood. Which direction took he? Quick, point it out to me. He but wait, I will go with thee." "Good, good. Why, truly thou art better than thy looks." "Marry, I do not think there's not another archangel with so right a heart as thine. Wilt ride? Wilt take the wee donkey that's for my boy, or wilt thou fork thy holy legs over this ill-conditioned slave of a mule that I have provided for myself, and had been cheated in too, had he cost but the indifferent sum of a month's usury on a brass farthing let to a tinker out of work? No, ride thy mule, and lead thine ass, I am surer on mine own feet, and will walk. Then prithee mind the little beast for me while I take my life in my hands and make what success I may toward mounting the big one." Then followed a confusion of kicks, cuffs, tramplings, and plungings, accompanied by a thunderous intermingling of volleyed curses, and finally a bitter apostrophe to the mule, which must have broken its spirit, for hostilities seemed to cease from that moment. With unutterable misery the fettered little king heard the voices and footsteps fade away and die out. All hope forsook him now for the moment, and a dull despair settled down upon his heart. "My only friend is deceived and got rid of," he said. "The hermit will return," and he finished with a gasp, and at once fell to struggling so frantically with his bonds again that he shook off the smothering sheepskin. And now he heard the door open. The sound chilled him to the marrow. Already he seemed to feel the knife at his throat. Horror made him close his eyes. Horror made him open them again, and before him stood John Canty and Hugo. He would have said thank God if his jaws had been free. A moment or two later his limbs were at liberty, and his captors, each gripping him by an arm, were hurrying him with all speed through the forest. Once more King Fufu I was roving with the tramps and outlaws, but for their coarse jests and dull-witted railleries, and sometimes the victim of small spitefulness at the hands of Canty and Hugo when the ruffler's back was turned. None but Canty and Hugo really disliked him. Some of the others liked him, and all admired his pluck and spirit. During 2 or 3 days Hugo, in whose ward and charge the king was, did what he covertly could to make the boy uncomfortable, and at night, during the customary orgies, he amused the company by putting small indignities upon him, always as if by accident. Twice he stepped upon the king's toes accidentally, and the king, as became his royalty, was contemptuously unconscious of it and indifferent to it. But the 3rd time Hugo entertained himself in that way, the king felled him to the ground with a cudgel, to the prodigious delight of the tribe. Hugo, consumed with anger and shame, sprang up, seized a cudgel, and came at his small adversary in a fury. Instantly a ring was formed around the gladiators, and the betting and cheering began. But poor Hugo stood no chance whatever. His frantic and lubberly prentice work found but a poor market for itself when pitted against an arm which had been trained by the first masters of Europe in single-stick, quarter-staff, and every art and trick of swordsmanship. The little king stood, alert but at graceful ease, and caught and turned aside the thick rain of blows with a facility and precision which set the motley onlookers wild with admiration, and every now and then when his practised eye detected an opening, and a lightning-swift rap upon Hugo's head followed as a result, the storm of cheers and laughter that swept the place was something wonderful to hear. At the end of 15 minutes, Hugo, all battered, bruised, and the target for a pitiless bombardment of ridicule, slunk from the field, and the unscathed hero of the fight was seized and borne aloft upon the shoulders of the joyous rabble to the place of honor beside the ruffler, where with vast ceremony he was crowned king of the gamecocks, his meaner title being at the same time solemnly cancelled and annulled, and a decree of banishment from the gang pronounced against any who should thenceforth utter it. Attempts to make the king serviceable to the troop had failed. He had stubbornly refused to act. Moreover, he was always trying to escape. He had been thrust into an unwatched kitchen the first day of his return. He not only came forth empty-handed, but tried to rouse the housemates. He was sent out with a tinker to help him at his work. He would not work. Moreover, he threatened the tinker with his own soldering iron. And finally both Hugo and the tinker found their hands full with the mere matter of keeping his from getting away. He delivered the thunders of his royalty upon the heads of all who hampered his liberties, or tried to force him to service. He was sent out in Hugo's charge in company with a slatternly woman and a diseased baby, to beg. But the result was not encouraging. He declined to plead for the mendicants, or be a party to their cause in any way. Thus several days went by, and the miseries of this tramping life and the weariness and sordidness and meanness and vulgarity of it became gradually and steadily so intolerable to the captive that he began at last to feel that his release from the hermit's knife must prove only a temporary respite from death at best. But But at night in his dreams these things were forgotten and he was on his throne and master again. This, of course, intensified the sufferings of the awakening, so the mortifications of each succeeding morning of the few that passed between his return to bondage and the combat with Hugo grew bitterer and bitterer and harder to bear. The morning after that combat, Hugo got up with a heart filled with vengeful purposes against the king. He had two plans in particular. One was to inflict upon the lad what would be, to his proud spirit and imagined royalty, a peculiar humiliation, and if he failed to accomplish this, his other plan was to put a crime of some kind upon the king, and then betray him into the implacable clutches of the law. In pursuance of the first plan, he purposed to put a climb upon the king's leg, rightly judging that that would mortify him to the last and perfect degree, and as soon as the climb should operate he meant to get Canty's help and force the king to expose his leg in the highway and beg for alms. Climb was the cant term for a sore, artificially created. To make a climb, the operator made a paste or poultice of unslaked lime, soap, and the rust of old iron, and spread it upon a piece of leather. Hitch was then bound tightly upon the leg. This would presently fret off the skin and make the flesh raw and angry-looking. Blood was then rubbed upon the limb, which, being fully dried, took on a dark and repulsive color. Then a bandage of soiled rags was put on in a cleverly careless way which would allow the hideous ulcer to be seen and move the compassion of the passer-by. 18. Hugo got the help of the tinker, whom the king had cowed with the soldering iron. They took the boy out on a tinkering tramp, and as soon as they were out of sight of the camp they threw him down, and the tinker held him while Hugo bound the poultice tight and fast upon his leg. The king raged and stormed, and promised to hang the two the moment the scepter was in his hand again, but they kept a firm grip upon him, and enjoyed his impotent struggling and jeered at his threats. This continued until the poultice began to bite, and in no long time its work would have been perfected if there had been no interruption. But there was, for about this time, the slave who had made the speech denouncing England's laws appeared on the scene and put an end to the enterprise, and stripped off the poultice and bandage. The king wanted to borrow his deliverer's cudgel and warm the jackets of the two rascals on the spot, but the man said no, it would bring trouble, leave the matter till night, the whole tribe being together, then the outside world would not venture to interfere or interrupt. He marched the party back to camp and reported the affair to the ruffler, who listened, pondered, and then decided that the king should not be again detailed to beg, since it was plain he was worthy of something higher and better, wherefore, on the spot he promoted him from the mendicant rank and appointed him to steal. Hugo was overjoyed. He had already tried to make the king steal, and failed, but there would be no more trouble of that sort now, for of course the king would not dream of defying a distinct command delivered directly from headquarters. So he planned a raid for that very afternoon, purposing to get the king in the law's grip in the course of it, and to do it, too, with such ingenious strategy that it should seem to be accidental and unintentional, for the king of the Gamecocks was popular now, and the gang might not deal over gently with an unpopular member who played so serious a treachery upon him as the delivering him over to the common enemy, the law. Very well. All in good time Hugo strolled off to a neighboring village with his prey, and the two drifted slowly up and down one street after another, the one watching sharply for a sure chance to achieve his evil purpose, and the other watching as sharply for a chance to dart away and get free of his infamous captivity forever. Both threw away some tolerably fair-looking opportunities, for both, in their secret hearts, were resolved to make absolutely sure work this time, and neither meant to allow his fevered desires to seduce him into any venture that had much uncertainty about it. Hugo's chance came first, for at last a woman approached who carried a fat package of some sort in a basket. Hugo's eyes sparkled with sinful pleasure as he said to himself, "Breath o' my life, and I can but put that upon him. 'Tis good den and God keep thee, king of the game." Cox. He waited and watched, outwardly patient but inwardly consuming with excitement till the woman had passed by, and the time was ripe, then said in a low voice, "Tarry here till I come again," and darted stealthily after the prey. The king's heart was filled with joy he could make his escape, now if Hugo's quest only carried him far enough away. But he was to have no such luck. Hugo crept behind the woman, snatched the package, and came running back, wrapping it in an old piece of blanket which he carried on his arm. The hue and cry was raised in a moment by the woman, who knew her loss by the lightening of her burden, although she had not seen the pilfering done. Hugo thrust the bundle into the king's hands without halting, saying, "Now speed ye after me with the rest, and cry, 'Stop, thief!' But mind ye, lead them astray." The next moment Hugo turned a corner and darted down a crooked alley, and in another moment or two he lounged into view again, looking innocent and indifferent, and took up a position behind a post to watch. Results: the insulted king threw the bundle on the ground, and the blanket fell away from it just as the woman arrived, with an augmenting crowd at her heels. She seized the king's wrist with one hand, snatched up her bundle with the other, and began to pour out a tirade of abuse upon the boy, while he struggled, without success, to free himself from her grip. Hugo had seen enough. His enemy was captured, and the law would get him now, so he slipped away, jubilant and chuckling, and wended campwards, framing a judicious version of the matter to give to the ruffler's crew as he strode along. The king continued to struggle in the woman's strong grasp, and now and then cried out in vexation, "Unhand me, thou foolish creature! It was not I that bereaved thee of thy paltry goods." The crowd closed around, threatening the king and calling him names. A brawny blacksmith in leather apron, and sleeves rolled to his elbows, made a reach for him, saying he would trounce him well for a lesson, but just then a long sword flashed in the air and fell with convincing force upon the man's arm, flat side down, the fantastic owner of it remarking pleasantly at the same time, "Marry, good souls, let us proceed gently, not with ill blood and uncharitable words. This is matter for the law's consideration, not private and unofficial handling. Loose thy hold from the boy, good wife." The blacksmith averaged the stalwart soldier with a glance, then went muttering away, rubbing his arm. The woman released the boy's wrist reluctantly. The crowd eyed the stranger unlovingly, but prudently closed their mouths. The king sprang to his deliverer's side with flushed cheeks and sparkling eyes, exclaiming, "Thou hast lagged sorely, but thou comest in good season now, sir. Miles, carve me this rabble to rags." Hendon forced back a smile, and bent down and whispered in the king's ear, "Softly, softly, my prince, wag thy tongue warily, nay, suffer it not to wag at all. Trust in me, all shall go well in the end." Then he added to himself, "Sir Miles, bless me, I had totally forgot I was a knight. Lord, how marvellous a thing it is, the grip his memory doth take upon his quaint and crazy fancies. An empty and foolish title is mine, and yet it is something to have deserved it, for I think it is more honor to be held worthy to be a spectre knight in his kingdom of dreams and shadows than to be held base enough to be an earl in some of the real kingdoms of this world. The crowd fell apart to admit a constable, who approached and was about to lay his hand upon the king's shoulder, when Hendon said, "Gently, good friend, withhold your hand, he shall go peaceably. I am responsible for that. Let on, we will follow." The officer led with the woman and her bundle, Miles and the king followed after with the crowd at their heels. The king was inclined to rebel, but Hendon said to him in a low voice, "Reflect, sire, your laws are the wholesome breath of your own royalty. Shall their source resist them, yet require the branches to respect them? Apparently one of these laws has been broken. When the king is on his throne again, can it ever grieve him to remember that when he was seemingly a private person, he loyally sank the king in the citizen and submitted to its authority? Thou art right, say no more. Thou shalt see that whatsoever the king of England requires a subject to suffer, under the law, he will himself suffer, while he holdeth the station of a subject." When the woman was called upon to testify before the justice of the peace, she swore that the small prisoner at the bar was the person who had committed the theft. There was none able to show the contrary, so he king stood convicted. The bundle was now unrolled, and when the contents proved to be a plump little dressed pig, the judge looked troubled whilst Hendon turned pale, and his body was thrilled with an electric shiver of dismay. But the king remained unmoved, protected by his ignorance. The judge meditated during an ominous pause, then turned to the woman with the question, "What dost thou hold this property to be worth?" The woman courtesied and replied, 3 shillings and 8 pence, your worship. I could not abate a penny, and set forth the value honestly. The justice glanced around uncomfortably upon the crowd, then nodded to the constable and said, "Clear the court and close the doors." It was done. None remained but the 2 officials, the accused, the accuser, and Miles Hendon. This latter was rigid and colorless, and on his forehead big drops of cold sweat gathered, broke and blended together, and trickled down his face. The judge turned to the woman again and said in a compassionate voice, "'Tis a poor ignorant lad, and mayhap was driven hard by hunger, for these be grievous times for the unfortunate. Mark you, he hath not an evil face, but when hunger driveth, good woman, dost know that when one steals a thing above the value of 13 pence ha'penny, the law saith he shall hang for it." The little king started, wide-eyed with consternation, but controlled himself and held his peace. But not so the woman. She sprang to her feet, shaking with fright, and cried out, "Oh, good lack, what have I done? God a mercy, I would not hang the poor thing for the whole world. Ah, save me from this, your worship. What shall I do? What can I do?" The justice maintained his judicial composure, and simply said, "Doubtless it is allowable to revise the value, since it is not yet writ upon the record. Then in God's name call the pig 8 pence, and heaven bless the day that freed my conscience of this awesome thing." Miles Hendon forgot all decorum in his delight, and surprised the king, and wounded his dignity by throwing his arms around him and hugging him. The woman made her grateful adieus and started away with her pig, and when the constable opened the door for her, he followed her out into the narrow hall. The justice proceeded to write in his record book. Hendon, always alert, thought he would like to know why the officer followed the woman out, so he slipped softly into the dusky hall and listened. He heard a conversation to this effect: "It is a fat pig and promises good eating. I will buy it of thee. Here is the 8 pence. 8 pence, indeed. Thou'lt do no such thing. It cost me 3 shillings and 8 pence, good honest coin of the last reign. that old Harry that's just dead ne'er touched or tampered with. A fig for thy 8 pence. Stands the wind in that quarter? Thou wast under oath, and so swore falsely when thou saidst the value was but 8 pence. Come straightway back with me before his worship, and answer for the crime, and then the lad will hang. There, there, dear heart, say no more, I am content. Give me the 8 pence, and hold thy peace about the matter. The woman went off crying. Hendon slipped back into the courtroom, and the constable presently followed, after hiding his prize in some convenient place. The justice wrote a while longer, then read the king a wise and kindly lecture, and sentenced him to a short imprisonment in the common jail, to be followed by a public flogging. The astounded king opened his mouth, and was probably going to order the good judge to be beheaded on the spot, but he caught a warning sign from Hendon, and succeeded in closing his mouth again before he lost anything out of it. Hendon took him by the hand, now made reverence to the justice, and the two departed in the wake of the constable toward the jail. The moment the street was reached, the inflamed monarch halted, snatched away his hand, and exclaimed, "Idiot, dost imagine I will enter a common jail alive?" Hendon bent down and said somewhat sharply, "Will you trust in me? Peace, and forbear to worsen our chances with dangerous speech. What God wills will happen, thou canst not hurry it. Thou canst not alter it, therefore wait, and be patient, 'twill be time enow to rail or rejoice when what is to happen has happened." The short winter day was nearly ended. The streets were deserted, save for a few random stragglers, and these hurried straight along with the intent look of people who were only anxious to accomplish their errands as quickly as possible, and then snugly housed themselves from the rising wind and the gathering twilight. They looked neither to the right nor to the left. They paid no attention to our party. They did not even seem to see them. Edward VI wondered if the spectacle of a king on his way to jail had ever encountered such marvelous indifference before. By and by, the constable arrived at a deserted market square, and proceeded to cross it. When he had reached the middle of it, Hendon laid his hand upon his arm, and said in a low voice, "Bide a moment, good sir, there is none in hearing, and I would say a word to thee." "My duty forbids it, sir, prithee hinder me not, the night comes on." "Stay, nevertheless, for the matter concerns thee nearly. Turn thy back a moment, and seem not to see. Let this poor lad escape." "This to me, sir. I arrest thee in." "Nay, be not too hasty. See thou be careful, and commit no foolish error." Then he shut his voice down to a whisper, and said in the man's ear, "The pig thou hast purchased for 8 pence may cost thee thy neck." "Man!" The poor constable, taken by surprise, was speechless at first, then found his tongue and fell to blustering and threatening, but Hendon was tranquil, and waited with patience till his breath was spent, then said, "I have a liking to thee, friend, and would not willingly see thee come to harm. Observe, I heard it all, every word. I will prove it to thee." Then he repeated the conversation which the officer and the woman had had together in the hall, word for word, and ended with, "There have I set it forth correctly? Should not I be able to set it forth correctly before the judge if occasion required?" The man was dumb with fear and distress for a moment. Then he rallied, and said with forced lightness, "'Tis making a mighty matter indeed out of a jest. I but plagued the woman for mine amusement." "Kept you the woman's pig for amusement?" The man answered sharply, "Not else. Good sir, I tell thee 'twas but a jest." "I do begin to believe thee," said Hendon, with a perplexing mixture of mockery and half-conviction in his tone. "But tarry thou here a moment, whilst I run and ask his worship for Nathless, he being a man. experienced in law and jests in. He was moving away, still talking. The constable hesitated, fidgeted, spat out an oath or two, then cried out, "Hold, hold, good sir, prithee wait a little, the judge. Why, man, he hath no more sympathy with a jest than hath a dead corpse. Come, and we will speak further. Odious body, I seem to be an evil case, and all for an innocent and thoughtless pleasantry. I am a man of family, and my wife and little ones list to reason. Good your worship, what wouldst thou of me? Only that thou be blind and dumb and paralytic, whilst one may count 100,000 counting slowly," said Hendon with the expression of a man who asks but a reasonable favor, and that a very little one. "It is my destruction," said the constable despairingly. "Ah, be reasonable, good sir. Only look at this matter on all its sides and see how mere a jest it is, how manifestly and how plainly it is so. And even if one granted it were not a jest, it is a fault so small that e'en the grimmest penalty it could call forth would be but a rebuke and warning from the judge's lips." Hendon replied with a solemnity which chilled the air about him, "This jest of thine hath a name in law. What it is? I knew it not. Peradventure I have been unwise. I never dreamed it had a name. Ah, sweet heaven, I thought it was original. Yes, it hath a name. In the law this crime is called non compos mentis. Lex talionis sic transit gloria mundi. Ah, my God! And the penalty is death. God be merciful to me, a sinner, by advantage taken of one in fault, in dire peril, and at thy mercy thou hast seized goods worth above 13 pence halfpenny, paying but a trifle for the same, and this in the eye of the law is constructive barratry, misprision of treason, malfeasance in office ad hominem, expurgatus in statu quo, and the penalty is death by the halter, without ransom, commutation, or benefit of clergy. Bear me up, sweet sir, my legs do fail me. Be thou merciful, spare me this doom, and I will turn my back and see not. That shall happen. Good. Now thou art wise and reasonable, and thou wilt restore the pig. I will indeed, nor ever touch another, though heaven send it and an archangel fetch it. Go, I am blind, for thy sake I see nothing. I will say thou didst break in and wrest the prisoner from my hands by force. It is but a crazy, ancient door, I will batter it down myself betwixt midnight and the morning. Do it, good soul, no harm will come of it. The judge hath a loving charity for this poor lad, and will shed no tears and break no jailer's bones for his escape.